بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful, all praise is due to Allah. May His peace and blessings be upon His Prophet Muhammad and all the prophets and messengers and those that follow in his footsteps. Ameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be upon you and the mercy of Allah and His blessings. We continue in our series in awe of the Almighty, because we promised in the introduction, if you know Him, you will certainly be in awe of Him. And if you know Him, you will love Him. And if you love Him, you will obey Him. And if you obey Him, your relationship with Him will grow closer and closer. And just a quick reflection about why this topic, because there's many topics to discuss. One line. Why discuss in awe of the Almighty? Why discuss the names of Allah? Because Muslims have forgotten that Islam is all about Allah. And most of the Quran is description of Allah, His attributes, accounts before Him so that people may reform their actions and their character. Stories of those in the past that have reformed themselves and succeeded, and those that have made other choices and the consequences of those choices. This is the core of Islam, so I'm hoping through our meetings and our discussions we remind ourselves of this central concept. Today we have three names, three closely interconnected names of Allah the Exalted. We have the name of Allah, al-Malik. And al-Malik can be translated as the sovereign or the king, the complete and supreme controller of all things. And we have the name of Allah, al-Malik, which means the owner. And we'll discuss how His ownership is different from anyone else's ownership. And we have the name of Allah, al-Malik, which has a similar meaning to these. Brothers and sisters, if you know al-Malik, you will never seek any part of His kingdom except through Him. If you know al-Malik, then you will never seek provision with anyone else, because all of the provision of the heavens and the earth is in His hands. And if you know al-Malik, you will use what you have for good and never for bad, because you will view your possessions as a trust from its true owner. Today we'll have two segments in the session. First, we'll discuss the existence of al-Malik and the attributes of Allah that relate to this name in the Quran and in our daily lives. And then we will discuss how we can live with this name, how this name can reform our action and our character. Allah the Exalted says in Surah Al-Hashr, which is chapter number 59, verse number 23, هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو الملك. He is Allah. There is no God but He, and among the names that Allah mentions is al-Malik, the sovereign and supreme commander. And we have the verse that all of us memorize, which is in the opening chapter of the Quran, Surah Al-Fatiha, wherein Allah described Himself as Maliki Yawmiddin, owner and master of the Day of Judgment. And in another recitation of the Quran, for example, the recitation of Warsh, it is Maliki Yawmiddin, king or sovereign supreme over the Day of Judgment. When we go back to the root meaning of this word in Arabic, al-Mulk can mean, number one, the ability to control and administer. And this is what is captured in the name of Allah, al-Malik, the one who controls all affairs of the heavens and the earth. The one whose command cannot be repelled and whose action cannot be questioned by anyone. And the second meaning of this root word is ownership. And this is what we said is the meaning of al-Malik, or the owner. Again, وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى, as we always say, Allah is beyond all description. But let's take some examples from our daily lives so we can better understand a part of these attributes. You can meet a person who has sovereignty or control over something, but they lack ownership. Or you can meet an owner who owns something but cannot control it. or doesn't have the legal or other authority to control what they own. So Allah the Exalted, when He describes Himself as al-Malik and al-Malik, He both owns and controls all things. And this is the highest form and the most complete form of ownership and control. Let's take some examples. Imagine that a person owns something but lacks the authority to use it. Like what? Like I have a deed to some land. Do I own it? I own it in the sense of this life. We'll talk about real ownership in a few minutes. But the state or the government designates this land as a conservation area or a wetland, or puts another regulation on my land. The government does not own the land, but it can control my use of the land to the point where it can prohibit me from building on it. If I want to build a house or so on, the decree of the government has blocked me from doing this. So this is ownership without total control. Or imagine an example of the reverse. Can anybody think of something? I'm sure there's something that you've all went through. Who's ever rented a car? So by renting a car, you're not a temporary owner of the car. You're only given temporary permission to operate it and exercise your control over it, and even that is within certain regulations. But the ownership at all times remain the company that you rented it from. To take a more overarching example in the right of Allah, a shepherd was once asked, whose sheep are these? And they were his flock of sheep. But he replied, Allah owns them and I am entrusted with them. Brothers and sisters, I'm not telling you this because it sounds good. I'm telling you this because this attitude reforms the way you deal with what you have. What you have is no longer something that was given to you because you're special, or because you're rich, or because you're smart. But when you know Allah al-Malik, what you have from Allah is a trust from Allah. And imagine, brothers and sisters, when somebody lets you borrow something, aren't you that much more careful to treat it in the best way? If you're a good person, of course. I'm not talking about someone who's, taking advantage of the rental, or, says, I don't own it, let me destroy it. But a good person is going to take extra care of this borrowed provision and make sure it's not harmed. And if they're of good character, they'll take better care of it than what they own themselves. So the believer sees al-Malik, Allah the Exalted, as owning and controlling all belongings and faculties that they have. So all of their provisions, their house, their car, but more than that, their faculties, their eyes, their ears, their body in its entirety and itself. They see these as a trust from Allah the Exalted. A trust so that you can have these tools to use, to live an upright life and exercise His commands. Because these gifts from Allah allow us to do things and allow us to discharge our affairs. But let's take a moment here and do a reality check. If someone is really being critical of what I'm saying, maybe they said, time out. How don't I own the car? I can walk to my file cabinet and pull out the title, and the state says that I own the car. And on this level, you are correct. But again, we have failed to differentiate our ownership from Allah's ownership. Because our ownership is temporary and transitory. So if God forbid you were to get into an accident with the car, then your ownership of the car, as it were, has ceased. Even if you have your title, the most you can get is settlement for it in cash, for example, or if it's repairable. But your ownership of the car as it once existed has ceased. And even if your car never gets into an accident, and the car lives 50 or 60 years, if you have cars that live 50 or 60 years, I want to talk to you, be interested in using it myself. But even if the car lives that long, there is someone that will not live forever, and that is you, and that is me. So if nothing else, death will separate you from your ownership and your provision. But Allah, God's ownership is permanent and real. And that is why it is the supreme ownership. I don't only mean that He owns the car while you're driving it. But imagine that Allah owned the car when it was metal and hadn't been dug out of the ground yet. Allah owned every part. Allah owned the plastic before it was fabricated. He owned the components before they were brought together. And He owns it while you use it, and He owns it long after it becomes scrap metal, or you leave it and depart, or sell it, or anything happens. So Allah's ownership is the permanent and real ownership. But everything I've been talking about is our ownership, right? I've been speaking to every individual. But now look to your right and look to your left. So Allah owns that person's faculties and belongings. And everyone that's in this room, everyone that's not in this room, everyone that once was, and everyone that once will be, or will be born in the future. And even realms that we do not see, do not perceive, do not understand. Allah is the supreme owner and sovereign controller of this entire realm, the seen and unseen from it. Brothers and sisters, let me be frank with you. We're in the age of technology. And sometimes the advancement of our technology makes us forget how incredibly dependent we are on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So not only does He own what we have, but He owns everything we need. So the air that we breathe is within His control. If He withholds it for a few minutes, we're goners. The food that we eat and the liquids that we drink are part of His dominion and His creation, exalted and glorified be He. And what is beautiful to me is when you go back to the Holy Quran, you read a chapter called Suratul Waqi'ah. And Allah therein mentions 4 needs, none of which humanity in the 21st century, with all of its technological advancements, has figured out how to rid their need of Allah in these needs. As if Allah is saying, if you can't figure out how to get anywhere on these 4 basic needs, then what about everything else that we're dependent on Allah for? So Allah mentions in Surah Al-Waqi'ah the miracle of human birth. And He asks the people, He asks you and I, do you create the new fetus, the new baby, or are we the creators? So humanity in all of its advancement, still Allah decrees that a mother and a father start a family, and there's no other way. And then Allah speaks about the harvest and the crops. And I have to ask you to know, we think that people go to the back of our supermarket and just pull the fruits and vegetables out of drawers. And when the drawers get empty, new fruits and vegetables appear. But we have to remember that with all of this advancement, our food and our crops still come from the ground and are still dependent on water. And agricultural science may benefit, output or deal with irrigation, but it takes us nowhere with our ultimate dependence on Allah. So Allah asks, are we the ones that cause these plants to grow, or are you the ones that cause them to grow? And then Allah speaks about water, from which every living thing was created and which is the ultimate human need for sustenance. And He asks, are you the ones that cause it to descend from the heavens, or are we the ones that command it to descend? If we wished, we would have made it extremely salty, unfit for human consumption. So if only you would show gratitude to Allah. Brothers and sisters, if you're on the beach and dying of thirst and the ocean is spread out before you, if you reach out your hand and drink from the salt water, you only accelerate your demise. You're only speeding up your death. So this water, if Allah causes a drought or withholds His provision, if every water engineer and every governor and every king and every powerful person and every genius all gather together, can they issue an ordinance to cause the water to come down if Allah withholds it? And then Allah also mentions our need for fire, and these are just some of our needs of Allah the Exalted. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala glorifies Himself in the Quran. And He says in Surah Al-Mu'minun, chapter number 23, verse number 116, فَتَعَالَى اللَّهُ الْمَلِكُ الْحَقِّ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا هُوَ رَبُّ الْعَرْشِ الْكَرِيمِ. Exalted be God, the true King. There is no God but He, the Lord of the glorious throne. And He describes the companions of paradise, saying they are في مقعد صدق عند مليك مقتدر. They are secure in the presence of an all-powerful sovereign controller. And He says in the verse that we teach all of our young ones, in the last chapter of the Holy Quran, chapter number 114, Surah An-Nas, قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ النَّاسِ مَلِكِ النَّاسِ, the supreme controller and sovereign above humanity. But now I want us to look at the sovereignty of Allah from another angle and dimension. I want you to imagine the earth. And imagine if you've ever traveled overseas or traveled across the country, how exhausted you were after that long plane ride, right? And you're stretching your legs, and the airplane food is not exactly the most gourmet food you've ever tasted, and so on. And you haven't even circled the whole earth. You've just made a long trip. Now I'm going to give you a measure. I want you to imagine that you circle the entire earth, but not on a plane ride, not in 24 hours. I want you to imagine that you do it so fast that you circle the earth more than 7 times in 1 second. More than 7 times in 1 second. And if you were to do this, you would be traveling at the speed of light. Okay? Everybody with me? So we're traveling at the speed of light, fast enough to go around the earth 7 times in 1 second. Now we're going to define the distance that light travels in a year. So take that second, times 60 seconds in a minute, times, and if the number wasn't going to be so huge that it was meaningless, I would give it to you. But it's huge and it's going to overload our calculators. But that is a light year. That's a distance, not a time. Everybody with me? Now, who's heard of the Hubble Space Telescope? The Hubble telescope, the ultra deep field, has seen 13 billion light years away. So that distance times what? Times 13 billion. That's 13 million million. That's 13 times 10 to the 9th. Everybody with me? Now, that is not the first heaven. That is the extent of what we have seen in the first heaven. And currently, we are not able to see past that, even if there does exist something past that in the first heaven. But all of this is the first heaven. Now, how many heavens are there? 7. And the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ says the first heaven, the likeness of it to the second heaven is what? Is like a ring in a vast desert. So this is worse than a needle in a haystack, right? This is worse. This is a greater example than a needle in a haystack. This is a ring in a vast desert. But that's the second heaven. Then the second heaven is like a ring in a vast desert to the third. Third to the fourth. Fourth to the fifth. Fifth to the sixth. Sixth to the seventh. Is that it? No, Allah says the seventh heaven is like a ring in a vast desert compared to the kursi of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the kursi is like a ring in a vast desert compared to the arsh, to the throne of Allah the Exalted. So brothers and sisters, at the end of this hadith, we have only one question to ask. What about al-Malik Himself, if this is only His throne. And of course, Allah cannot be encompassed or contained or described by time or by place or by any limitations like these when He is the controller and the creator of all of these. We'll take a quick break and we'll be right back, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So we said that the only real permanent sovereignty belongs to Allah alone. And the Prophet ﷺ captures this in his hadith, in his tradition. La Malik illallah. This is in Sahih Muslim. There is no true king but Allah. Meaning any king, any ruler, any person with authority, they have some type of authority in this life. But the real sovereignty is to Allah alone. And the Prophet ﷺ says in another narration, La Malik illallah. There is no true, real owner except Allah. And Imam al-Razi has a beautiful description of the name of Allah, al-Malik. He says, He is a king unlike other kings. Because other kings, regardless of their wealth decreases with giving and goodness. So if I have lots and lots of money, if I make a donation to a charitable organization, my dominion has decreased. But Allah the Exalted, not only is His dominion without description unfathomable, unbelievable, but His dominion only increases when He gives and when He bestows. So imagine, brothers and sisters, a mother and a father are blessed with a child. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we can only describe His dominion as increasing. Although really, the child was part of His dominion all along. But let me push us a step further. There is a beautiful, beautiful dimension to al-Malik, the name of Allah, al-Malik, which is in the Holy Quran that many people miss out on. I'm going to take us all the way back to the first two verses that we described. Remember, we said, Huwa Allahu alladhi la ilaha illa huwa al-Malik. He is Allah, there is no God but Him, the supreme sovereign controller. But do you know what Allah said just before that? Huwa ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And when we go to Surah Al-Fatiha, what's the verse before Maliki Yawmiddin? Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The most gracious, compassionate, the most merciful. So brothers and sisters, we started by saying none can compel Allah to do anything. None can question His command and none can repel His decree. But Allah, in His majesty and His power, decreed upon Himself and mandated upon Himself that His mercy would supersede His wrath and His anger. As if these verses in the Quran tell us that no sovereignty can be complete without completeness of mercy and grace. If this is Allah, whom no one can force Him to be like this, then what of us when our sovereignty is merely a trust from Allah and temporary and transitory? Brothers and sisters, I submit to you that this is among the most tragic misunderstandings of the nature of Allah in Islam, among Muslims and especially among people of other faiths. Because you ask people, who is the God of Islam? They'll tell you He's not the God of Abraham and Moses and Jesus, which is wrong. But then you will ask them, what is His predominant attribute? Most will describe Him as the God of vengeance. The God of vengeance. Whereas we are learning through our exploration of the names of Allah, that Allah appears with His attributes of mercy and grace to those that want to seek them. And even to those that are, which is everyone, under His supreme control and authority. He still appears with the attributes of mercy and grace. But for those that do not heed, and those that do not repent, and those that commit aggression and repression, and wrongdoing, and Allah gives them respite and they do not return, then yes, Allah is all powerful, supreme over these that have asked for these attributes. Brothers and sisters, another attribute of Allah's nature as al-Malik is that He is the grantor of sovereignty and ownership. And we alluded to this earlier when we said any ownership or authority we have is merely a temporary trust from Allah. So in Surah Ali Imran, chapter number 3, verse number 26, Allah the Exalted says, قُلِ اللَّهُمَّ مَالِكَ الْمُلْكِ تُؤْتِي الْمُلْكَ مَنْ تَشَاءُ وَتَنْزِعُ الْمُلْكَ مِمَّنْ تَشَاءُ وَتُعِزُّ مَنْ تَشَاءُ وَتُذِلُّ مَنْ تَشَاءُ بِيَدِكَ الْخَيْرُ إِنَّكَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ. Say, O Allah, owner of all sovereignty, you give control to whoever you will, and you remove control from whomever you will. And you elevate whomever you will, and you humble whomever you will. All that is good lies in your hand, and you have power over everything. So Allah has granted us temporary control and sovereignty over things so that He may test us. And in this, brothers and sisters, lies the answer to the questioner who may say, if Allah has these attributes, why doesn't He appear in physical form before us? And I apologize for asking this question, but it is a question that is asked, and it is a question that we have to address. Why don't we see Allah al-Malik before us, overpowering all of His creation? And why don't we see everyone kneeling in humility before His power before us? And of course we'll see this on the Day of Judgment. But the fact that we do not see it now, part of the divine wisdom in this is the secret to the creation of human beings in the first place. So if we did not have to work and invest to draw closer to Allah, if there was some material form in front of us, even if it wasn't to Allah, to make us immediately fall in immediate belief, without any questions, without any hesitation, then we have lost the prerequisite for judgment and reward and consequence. Because then human beings have become angels. There's no trust. There's no choice. And so why is there a day of judgment to reward you or punish you for that which you never did anything to earn? So Allah's existence as al-Malik, yet the fact that He leaves human beings with their temporary sovereignty and control to discharge their affairs as they will, righteously or wretchedly, correct or wrong, through goodness or through oppression. The fact that Allah leaves this respite is so that He may test us, as the Quran says, لِيَبْلُوَهُمْ أَيُّهُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا, so that He may test them which of them is best in conduct. And this is not forgetfulness from Allah the Exalted, far exalted and glorified be He above forgetting anything, but rather this is a period of respite until the Day of Judgment, when al-Malik will bring everyone to account, and when He will right every wrong and take the right of everyone that was oppressed. Brothers and sisters, Allah, as we have discussed, is the Supreme King. He grants freely and He repossesses freely. None can argue with Him. No one can make Him change His decree or stop Him from carrying out His command. He is unique in His decision and supreme in His command. This is a summary of just our partial understanding of the name of Allah al-Malik. And now we will close with some ingredients to live with the name al-Malik in our lives, to live conscious of al-Malik. One thing that we do is, as we alluded to earlier, we live conscious of our relationship with Allah, because we view Him as in full control of everything and owning everything, and owning either our life, even our life and our soul. And there was a beautiful, insightful question asked at the end of last session offline, wherein the questioner said, if Allah gives us free will, He does not compel us in this life to act righteously or act unrighteously, then why is it that we show gratitude to Allah when we're the ones that made the choice? This is a question we're asking out of innocence, not out of questioning the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But in fact, the name of Allah, al-Malik, has a key to answering this question. Because even when you made that choice, you would never have been able to act on it if it were not for the gifts of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Moreover, the ability to follow the truth rather than falsehood is in itself a gift from Allah. And everything we have is of His bounty and from His decree. And even our free will to exercise in our lives what we wish and then be brought to account for it says nothing and takes away nothing from the fact that Allah is fully acquainted with what we do and cannot be contained or described with place or with time. And so the future and the past are not for Him like they are for us, when He is the creator of time and He is the creator of the heavens and the earth. But brothers and sisters, we have to be cautious. Recognizing the authority of Allah al-Malik is not an invitation to be lazy. It's not an invitation to stop doing things. We don't say, oh, Allah is the controller of everything, so I woke up conveniently at 12 o'clock, I didn't wake up for Fajr on time. Because al-Malik decreed that this happened. Surely this happened with the knowledge of al-Malik, but you are responsible for the fact that you didn't work to make something else happen. And so although we put our trust and reliance on Allah, we take every worldly measure to act correctly and reform our character. So we set those alarm clocks, and we're good to our parents, and we give in charity, and we watch out, we check the prayer times. We don't wait to say, oh, it passed and I never checked. And we watch our tongues, and we guard our behavior. These worldly measures are upon us to take, and then the results are on Allah. So when we take the correct measure, but Allah decrees a result that we weren't expecting, then this is the true reliance on Allah al-Malik. And the believer, this is why they're righteous when nobody's watching. You see, even some of the best people on earth are only good when people are watching, are only good when the cameras are on, or somebody's there to notice, or somebody's saying thank you. But a relationship with God is really the only way that you can have a lasting commitment to the truth and to do what's right regardless of the circumstances and the surroundings. So the true believer gives charity if the person in need says thank you. And he gives charity if the person in need turns a cold shoulder and never says anything. The believer prays in congregation in the utmost humility and reverence to Allah. And he prays in the blackness of the night, in the darkness of his room when nobody sees him. He prays with the same humility and reverence to Allah. Because where the gazes of the people have ceased, the knowledge of Allah has not. And that knowledge, as we mentioned last session, وَهُوَ مَعَكُمْ أَيْنَمَا كُنْتُمْ. He is with you wherever you may be. And so, this causes reform and betterment in the believer's life. That was one way of living with al-Malik. The second one, and we'll close with this today, is an example we have from the Prophet of Allah, Yusuf or Joseph, may Allah be pleased with him. And at the very end of the story, Prophet Yusuf makes a beautiful supplication to Allah, which starts, رَبِّ قَدْ آتَيْتَنِي مِنَ الْمُلْكِ وَعَلَّمْتَنِي مِنْ تَأْوِيلِ الْأَحَادِيثِ. My Lord, you have given me authority. This is al-Mulk, the same root as al-Malik and al-Malik. And you taught me something of the interpretation of dreams. When you recite this verse, what's the first thing that crosses your mind? perhaps the first apparent authority that Yusuf has is the authority over Egypt. So remember, he was a minister and he was in charge of the storehouses and the grain that fed not only Egypt during this 7-year drought, but all of the Middle East. People would come and barter for grain in exchange for the goods that they brought from their countries. So this is the apparent sovereignty that Allah gave Yusuf, especially in light of the fact that one day he was in a well, or one day he was a slave, or one day he's in jail. This change of not stature, but position in life is very apparent. But some scholars extracted a beautiful, beautiful meaning from this verse. They said the best dominion and the most special control that Allah gave Yusuf was not control over people or political authority. It was sovereignty over his own soul and his own desires. And so the scholars said it wasn't the ability to feed Egypt that was as special as the ability to be invited to temptation and to say ma'adh Allah, God forbid. And it wasn't the cameras and the spotlight and the reverence of people and their praises that was as special as the ability to hold the keys of revenge coming out of jail to destroy the same society that stuck you in jail with no right to do so, and to not exercise revenge or vengeance. So that self-control and that uprightness of character is the most special sovereignty that a person can be granted. So our closing reminder and our homework for you and I is, when you live with al-Malik and in consciousness of al-Malik, subject your kingdom to his obedience and his subservience. Each of us, brothers and sisters, is a king or a queen. We are the king or queen of one. And our kingdom has many subjects. So our kingdom includes our eyes, our ears, our tongues, our hands and our feet, our bodies and our souls. So when you live with al-Malik, ask yourself if your eyes are crying and longing for God, or if your eyes are looking to scenes that al-Malik wouldn't like you to look to. Ask yourself if your ears are busy listening to the words of the Quran or exchanging good words, or if your ears are listening to something other than that. Or are your feet taking you to good places, or your feet taking you to places that al-Malik would not be pleased to see you in. So this kingdom of ours should be subjected and should be controlled to the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the person that does this has been given the greatest provision from al-Malik. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in closing to make us from the servants of al-Malik. Allahumma ameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.